Hi, everyone. I'm Zach McDowell, and here's my Module 9 case study. First off, we're going to start by summarizing the case, just uncovering the facts from our case study. First, Principal Richard Inman, first-year principal, has worked hard on forming relationships with some of his troubled students. James is a 15-year-old troubled student, looks up to Mr. Inman and has remained out of trouble for months now and has been showing a lot of improvement. A teacher had witnessed James handing something off to a student named David in the hallway. The teacher immediately called Principal Inman and explained what she saw and said that it could possibly be drugs. So Mr. Inman then pulled both of his students into the office. A school officer was called into the office due to the fact that they said it could be drugs, and searched to find that David was in possession of brass knuckles, which is a prohibited weapon on school grounds. James, when the event occurred, admitted he threatened David and forced him to take the knuckles. The school has a zero tolerance policy, and this offense would ground for a 45-day expulsion immediately. James was given a 45-day expulsion and sent to the disciplinary alternative education program. Mr. Inman had a hard time following the paperwork for David to be expelled due to him having zero disciplinary issues in the past and was an honor student in the school. Mr. Inman was very reluctant to fill out that paperwork because he felt that David wasn't at fault. The director of secondary education encouraged Mr. Inman to go ahead and file the paperwork in compliance with the school policies. The director then warned Mr. Inman that if he did not file the paperwork, he would have an official reprimand placed in his file for his career. Section 2 is about ethical and legal issues from the case. Let me move this out of the way real quick. So some legal issues to start off. Obviously, the brass knuckles are prohibited, and it's a felony possession of a weapon on school grounds, which warranted an arrest, and also threatening of another student to conceal the brass knuckles. Some ethical issues in this. James and David were treated equally. Richard is responsible for upholding school policies and rules due to their zero tolerance policy. Richard had both students' best interests in mind when thinking about their consequences. Richard is advocating for all students' future success, keeping their best interests in mind. David is expelled according to the district policy, the zero tolerance policy, and Mr. Inman is refraining from following the paperwork for David's expulsion. Some more with the ethical and legal issues. Their school code, brass knuckles are prohibited. There was threatening of another student. One of these students had been in a lot of trouble already, which plays a big part in this. And also the disciplinary alternative education program, which is a consequence for violating those school codes that go along with that zero tolerance policy. Speaking more on the ethical part of it, David's future could be harmed due to the expulsion of having the weapon and the school's zero tolerance policy. There was a breach of contract, or there was no breach of contract unless Mr. Inman does not file the paperwork for David. Richard will have an official reprimand placed in his file if he does not file the paperwork. The action of James and David did violate the school's rules with having a prohibited weapon on school grounds. And Richard is attempting to protect David due to his role in the situation and having zero issues in the school in the past. Section 3 synthesizes exactly what has happened. Richard, an assistant principal, is forced with an ethical dilemma of following the school policy or doing what he believes is right for his student. Section 4, we're going to synthesize the facts from the case. People involved, obviously Richard Inman, or Mr. Inman, who is the principal, dealing with the case. James is a 15-year-old troubled student, frequently in trouble with the school for things such as fighting and tardiness. David, the other individual in this case, he's an honor student and involved in perfect school record. He's never had any issues, good attendance. A teacher who reported the case was a bystander. The school police officer obviously was involved, and he has an oath to uphold the law. The director of secondary education, he is holding Mr. Inman accountable to withhold the school policy and follow through with it. James's mother obviously was angry at her son, and David's mother is angry at the administration and believes that her son should not receive consequences. This all happened at Rocket Junior High School in the hallway. Also, then after it happened, when they were called into Mr. Inman's office at this school, there are a variety of demographics. A diverse school, which is located on the south side, which in the case study stated that it's a troubled area for the youth. Programs in place. It is a junior high school and part of the public education system. Section 5, we're going to review and prioritize our information. First, we'll talk about the stakeholders and community. Obviously, this is going to cause damage to Richard, the students James and David, and it could ruin the students' chances of getting into college or receiving scholarships, and simply just ruining David's reputation of being a good student and withholding to those high standards. Mr. Inman could potentially lose integrity within the school based on his decision. It could damage Richard or Mr. Inman's career long-term if he were to have that reprimand on his file. It could cause James to not graduate. He's been showing a lot of improvement, and obviously this happened, which could cause a big issue with him in terms of graduation. Individuals with an important stake in the outcome. Obviously, Richard, Principal Inman, could face some consequences or backlash for his decision and has a really big impact on James and David. Stakeholders that have been consulted, David's mother and James's mother had a role in this as well. Some information that we still need. Why didn't David confront an adult after he was supposedly threatened to obtain the brass knuckles and hold on to him for James? Was the teacher who reported the case called in for a second opinion? Is there a program within the disciplinary action program to teach students about ethics and making ethical decisions or moral judgments? We still need to identify and review the school's code of ethics, or if they even have one. Who else can help with the decision-making process? That's a really big one. Obviously, Richard, Mr. Inman's going to need some help with this. Another thing, why were the brass knuckles brought onto school property? Investigate that situation further. James said that they were for something after school. Maybe that could help out some things, figuring out the real reason he was carrying those. Based on all the information provided, I think I'm able to make a decision. Section 6, we're going to identify our options and possible consequences that go along with those. My first option would be to refrain from filing any of the paperwork, and both students are not faced with any consequences. Option 2 would be Mr. Inman files the paperwork on both students in compliance with the district's zero tolerance policy. Option 3 would be to file the paperwork on James. Which would result in an expulsion of 45 days, and enforce that both students are to take an ethics course. Richard will receive an official reprimand for not enforcing the school's policy from the director of secondary education. Option 4 would be Principal Inman seeks for a second opinion on the situation and filing the paperwork. Mr. Inman would refrain from filing paperwork on David with reasoning based on core values and code of ethics and keeping the student's best interest in mind. Both students will be forced to take an educational ethics course, and Richard will have a private meeting with the school board and the director of secondary education on his decision made in reference to David's paperwork not being filed. Next, we're going to evaluate our options. That first decision, refrain from filing any paperwork, and both students are not faced with any consequences. Pros for that, the students will not have any consequences. We said that James was making significant improvements in school. David, we've heard, is a great student, does all the right things. This would cause David's future to not be damaged, and relationships aren't damaged between Principal Inman and James and David and their families. Cons for this, the school and Mr. Inman could lose credibility for this, not sticking to that policy, especially Richard or Mr. Inman. He'll lose some integrity with some stakeholders, and students were not taught any lessons from the situation. Decision 2 would be that Principal Inman files the paperwork on both students in compliance with the zero tolerance policy. Pros from this, the school policy is enforced and withheld. Students serve their consequence based on the policy. Richard's integrity is not at risk because he followed through with the policy that the director is offering or suggesting. Richard's integrity is not at risk. Richard's job would be secured. He wouldn't have anything on his file, and you're remaining in compliance with district's alternative education program. Cons from this, the students' futures will be compromised having this on their file. Relationships with parents will be damaged, specifically with David's, and Richard's ethical values will be questioned with his decision. My third decision would be to file the paperwork on James, which would enforce that both students are to take an ethics course. Richard will receive an official reprimand for not enforcing the school's policy. Pros for this, David's future is not damaged. Both students partake in a class that will teach them ethical values and ethical decision making. David's mother's relationship is not damaged with Mr. Inman. Richard's integrity would not be damaged as well. Cons to this, Mr. Inman's career could be damaged. The school's policy was not enforced in this case because both students would not be receiving the paperwork filled out with consequences. Discrimination comes into play, such as why both these students were involved with it. Why is only one student receiving the consequence based on their history of being in trouble with the school? Also, James' future is compromised. Obviously, the graduation requirements he may not meet. My fourth decision, Principal Inman seeks for a second opinion on the situation on filing of the paperwork of David. Richard refrains from filing the paperwork on David with reasoning based on his core values and his code of ethics. Both students will partake in an educational ethics course, and Principal Richard Inman will have a private meeting with the board and director of secondary education on the decision that was made in reference to David's paperwork not being filed. The pros for this, a second opinion would help him make a final decision. Relationships are salvaged. Students' participation in an ethics course would be a benefit to them. Richard's integrity is upheld. This would allow that core values in the code of ethics were at the forefront of the situation. Is also cultivating ethics with having them partake in an educational course about ethics. Cons to this, Mr. Inman could still face damages to his career, and also relationships with the school may be damaged as well. Section 8, we are going to choose our best option here. And in my opinion, our best option would be option number 4, to seek second opinion on the situation, and refrain from filing the paperwork temporarily. How I would go about this. The first, I would speak to the director of secondary education about my decision. I would seek advice from another member of the school or another leader, and collaborate on how to make the best ethical and moral decision. I would file the paperwork on James, because he owned bringing them to school. I would then discuss the participation of ethics courses with both students and their parents, and why those would hold value, due to the circumstances of the event. I would then speak with David's mother, and David about the decision, and speak to James's mother and James about the decision made, and try to stay in contact with him during his expulsion. Try to find a way to keep him making the progress that he was making before this event happened. Also, we'd have to speak with the Board of Education, privately, to discuss the decision and the possible outcomes. Have all stakeholders been consulted? James and his mother will be talked to privately about the decision, and also with David and his mother separately. The school board and director of secondary education consulted about the decision and the reprimands of not filing the paperwork on David, following through with that process. Have all options been thought of? Yes, this would allow for James to return early due to not using the brass knuckles, but he did have them in his possession. So we obviously want to think about that. If suspension of both students is required, David would receive a shorter suspension due to James confessing that he threatened him to do this. He brought him to school, and harassed David to hold on to them. Steps I would take. I would speak with the director of secondary education about my plan of action. I would then speak and discuss with the secondary leader, the director giving their opinion and knowledge on the decision being made. Third, I would call a private meeting with James and James's mother about the decision made, for the 45-day expulsion that was part of the school's zero tolerance policy, and try to keep in contact with them through the days and encourage the participation in an educational ethics course. Fourth, obviously, we call a meeting that we discussed about talking with David and his mother, ensure David's future will not be damaged, speaking with David about the situation and what should have done better, to help protect himself, how to make a better ethical decision about that, what happened, and speak with David about the situation and what he could have done differently, to avoid this conflict. Then speaking with the Board of Education and the director on the decision made, and I would then await possible repercussions that could happen from my decision, if there were any at all. What may happen from the situation? James's future could be compromised from him receiving the expulsion, and possibly not graduating on time. David's future would remain unharmed with this option. Both students would gain knowledge about ethics and decision-making during the course. Could cause some community pushback, with only one of the students receiving the punishment. Just word of mouth could come back, could damage my reputation, which could also cause discrimination to also become an issue, with only one student receiving the consequences. The Board of Education and director may not favor the decision that was made, and could once again come back on me. And Richard may face damages to the reputation, and his career is officially reprimanded for his decisions made. Who needs to know about the situation? The school staff that was involved, James and his mother, and David and his mother as well. Determine if you can deal with this on your own. I would then consult with the higher administration about choices. Obviously, I need some help with this decision. and bring in upper administration if the situation escalates beyond my plan of action that I had planned out. I want to make sure to warn and not threaten. While speaking to both sets of parents, explain why I'm making this decision based on my ethical values. I'll then explain that I would like for both boys to gain from each of their consequences. Obviously, they both made bad decisions. I want to make sure that they understand this could have been done differently in a better way. Explain what I will do to follow up that they are learning from their mistakes, and also explain what will happen if an offense were to arise again. If this doesn't work, obviously, I will have to resort back to the zero tolerance policy, and both students will be forced with the expulsion. Reflection. This case study serves as a realistic situation where moral and ethical decision making comes into play on making a decision that we know could be detrimental to a student's future career. While working through the situation, it was simple to see that no matter what decision I made, there was going to be the possibility of someone being upset and could cause some backlash to stakeholders, including myself. This is important to understand that a leader needs to research and consult with other trusting individuals on a situation before making a decision that could be life-changing to students or myself. It's really important to have mentors and people that I can talk to if I'm not sure on a decision. While doing this case study, it also became apparent that ethical education needs to be implemented within school districts to provide students the knowledge of doing what is right and wrong. A student needs to be taught what about ethical decision making and how their personal moral values are what guides them throughout their life. As a leader, I want to implement a moral compass both for personal and professional needs. As we teach students between right and wrong, they will need a visual to understand what is expected or taught to them. This will serve as a daily reminder to both staff and students if displayed in the classroom. As a future leader, I will ensure that I will always look for a second opinion on matters when needed and utilize my code of ethics and core values along with following school policy before making decisions that could leave a negative or positive impact on a student and keeping their needs and best interest in mind. This is all I have here. Thank you guys for watching.